Everyone ready? Okay. Thank you for coming, you diehards who are braving the cold and everything like that. Tonight's speaker is Doug Buckingham, and he is local to this area. He actually lives in the Lee, which is sort of the other side of Cheshire, Great Bissington area. And as you obviously know, he's going to be talking about regression therapy and hypnosis, and how you can use previous lives to treat present-day life conditions.
Exactly.
Things like that. So Doug will talk roughly for an hour, then we'll take a break, and then if you want to ask questions afterwards, and then come and look at his books and bung him some money at the very end, and hey presto, hopefully a great evening. So put your hands together for Doug. Thank you.
Thank you. I think what I'll probably do is I'll talk for a bit and I'll just see whether there's any questions, and I'll talk for a bit more, then I'll see whether there's any questions, as it's a nice small size group. So just to get started, you're right there?
Yeah, it's all right.
Okay.
We're going the wrong way. What way to start talking?
Yeah. So I never had to be convinced about reincarnation, or what I think of as the reality of it. I remember many, many years ago when I was a little boy watching a Barbra Streisand film with my mum and dad called On a Clear Day You Can See Forever. And this is going back to the 70s sometime. And in that film, Barbra Streisand was a typical crazy lady who went to see a psychiatrist, some French actor that I can't remember the name of, and she wanted to stop smoking. And as soon as she laid down on the couch, she went into a series of what appeared to be different lives. And for me, as an 8-year-old kid or whatever I was watching that film, one, lying down on the couch seemed pretty normal to go and do that sort of thing. And two, the fact that people might start to explore previous experiences seemed pretty normal as well. So I've always been a believer for no particular reason. It wasn't really, I didn't come from a particularly traditional family. I came from a standard old East End family where people up the road would read tea leaves and that kind of thing. But it was never really in my immediate family. And I never really did anything with it, apart from the fact that I sort of had a loose sort of belief that astrology worked and, you know, things like Reiki worked and things like that. But it wasn't really until the late 90s when a friend of mine whose mum happened to be a medium started talking about what his mum would get up to, and he'd start coming back, and when we'd go out for a night in the pub or whatever, he'd tell me what his mum had done the night before and what had been happening with her circle and all that sort of thing. And this for me, in about 20 years ago, this for me was just a source of fascination. And that was actually the start of my sort of journey into more interesting lifestyle, I'd say. So I started reading books about ancient civilizations and the connections between them. I started exploring things like Reiki. I started trying to understand it all through books. And probably the defining moment, or one of the defining moments of my life, was when I was with a girl that I was about to marry, actually, and we went to Machu Picchu together, and we'd done the Inca Trail, and we walked up, I think it's the first 3 days, and on the 4th day you actually get to Machu Picchu, and we got to Machu Picchu, and then my life changed, and I couldn't even begin to tell you what happened, but all I knew was that I felt very different. I felt as though I'd been there before. I felt as though something very strange was happening to me that I didn't have any context for. I had no previous experience of that kind of thing. And I had this awful knowing that whatever I did in my life, I mustn't marry this girl. I simply mustn't marry this girl. And funnily enough, that was how life turned out. And I ended up, as a result of that, obviously not being very popular with her, but I ended up changing my life. I was working in an office in London at the time, and I ended up selling my house, selling my car, going travelling, and actually finding myself and finding actually what I really wanted to do in life. And when I came back to London, I had this bizarre notion, and I'd sort of been abroad for 2.5 years or so, and I had some interesting experiences, but I had this bizarre notion in the back of my head that I needed to get my chakras fixed. I didn't really know what chakras were, to be honest with you, but that kind of led me to a place called the College of Psychic Studies, and at the College of Psychic Studies I ended up doing a healing course. That was all very interesting. And what that led me into quite indirectly was the fact that I had one really, at the time I considered to be a really bad habit, was that I smoked quite a lot of the time. And in fact, I was one of those smokers. I'd get out of bed in the morning and I'd think, where are they? Where are they? And that would be the first thought of the morning. And this led me into finding a hypnotherapist. At the time I lived in West London. I've been trying to stop smoking for 2 years, but the addiction really had hold of me. And I went to see the hypnotherapist, and I had a 2-hour appointment with the hypnotherapist, and I walked out of that and I never smoked again. And that really got me thinking, what the heck has gone on there? Because I'm a fairly strong-willed person. When I put my mind to something, I quite often achieve it. And so as a result of that, I ended up doing a short course in hypnosis, then ended up doing a longer course in hypnosis, then another course in hypnosis. I'd actually probably swap one addiction for another if I think about it. But anyway, I got quite fascinated with hypnosis. And during the course of our hypnotherapy, or one of the hypnotherapy trainings that I did, which was a 12-month course, we had a small section of a weekend module which was devoted to something called past life regression. And I was, for me, when I looked at the course prospectus, this was the most exciting thing on the whole course prospectus. Now, our instructor at the time started off that particular weekend. He said, we're going to do something, this is what we're going to do this weekend. We're going to do that, and that. And he said, oh yeah, and if we get time, we'll do this past life regression thing. And anyway, we did get time. And when he came to it, he said, we're going to do this, but if you get people who come to you who want a past life regression, try and get them to do something else. Because this stuff, it's a bit woo-woo. It's a bit out there. And, frankly, the way my life was developing, I was a bit woo-woo. I was a bit out there. So for me, that was like, yeah, I'll try a bit of that. And within the past life experience that I had that day, we actually had a practice session. We practiced on each other. I had an experience where there was a small boy in Asia, and my experience wasn't that pleasant. I had the sensation that my life was ended when a Chinese soldier came along and stabbed me through the stomach. And that was the end of my life. But it was actually quite interesting because it meant that the stomach pain that I'd been experiencing for the past 3 weeks disappeared just like that. And so that was one of the turning points, if you like, where I started to think, oh, maybe there's something a little bit more to this stuff than curiosity. And, when you start to follow your nose, then, in my mind, synchronicity comes into play and all sorts of things start to unfold in your life. And I found my way onto a past life regression training course. I ended up training other people, which is part of what I do now, and exploring it. A large part of my life, or my working life at least, and, sometimes my social life, involves talking about past life and current life regression and slightly strange experiences. So for me, it's an area of fascination, it's a job, and it's a bit of a passion as well. I've seen probably regressed in training courses, workshops and all sorts of things over the past 12 years, close to 5,000 people. And I've seen a lot of remarkable results with people, things that have changed for people. Generally, a lot of people will come to regression in the first place because they're slightly curious about who they might have been, what they might have done, where they might have lived. Sometimes people who are attracted to a particular type of a particular period in history will come along because they're fascinated in that, and they'll wonder what their connection is. That's a very good motivation. Curiosity can obviously lead us in certain directions. I mean, I remember probably about 9 years ago, I was living in London at the time, and he didn't tell me before he came, but it turned out that I had a vicar come. And I thought this was quite interesting. When he turned up and he started to tell me that, yes, he was actually the vicar for a reasonably sized church in central London. And he was coming along because he was utterly convinced that he'd been in that church before in a previous life. And I had to ask the obvious question. I said, look, you're a Christian. Surely this is this is not widely embraced. He says, well, I'm a Reiki 1, I'm a Reiki 2, I've done a course in mediumship, and I've done all these other things. And I'm going to say about as much as about them as I do about this experience, i.e. he was keeping it very, very quiet. But anyway, in his experience, he was indeed, he went back in the regression to that same church about 400 years earlier or 500 years earlier. I can't quite remember the time period. And he was, I'm not very good with religion, so I can't remember the names, but he was it's like he kept the gardens, a rector or a curate or something like that. He kept the gardens, he kept the graveyard all up to date, and that was his job. And what was interesting about that was that he knew where some particular bodies were buried around the church. Some, it wasn't Shakespeare, it wasn't Chaucer, but it was some sort of lower scale Shakespeare's and Chaucer's of that time, and he knew where they were buried around the church. And it just so happened in the 20th century, it would have been the 20th century because it was about 10 years ago, they were doing renovations around the church. And so he was actually able to say to the people who were doing the excavation, don't dig there because I think there's some bodies down there and we need to actually preserve those bodies. So it was actually quite fascinating of what he actually found as a result of that. So sometimes people come along as for curiosity, and I get a lot of people who come from healing courses around the county and other counties around who, you know, want to find out what they've been doing. But on the whole, what I get is a lot of people who want to solve a particular problem in their life, whether it's something physical, whether it's something emotional, whether it's something that's a relationship problem with a particular person in their life. I get a lot of people who see regression as a bit of problem solving. That's the main reason why people come to me. Now, just to sort of backtrack a bit, just out of interest, how many of you guys actually believe in reincarnation? Sitting on the fence.
Yeah.
Quite right too. Yeah, it's good to sit on the fence. Yeah. So it's most of you, you know, obviously with a group like this, that's quite high numbers, quite frankly. When I do a talk like this in some other places, I'm lucky if I get 5 hands out of 25. But I'm not seeking to convince anybody. I never seek to convince anybody with talks like this because I think you have to make up your own mind. But what's the evidence? If we look around the planet, what's the evidence for reincarnation? Culturally, you've got about 1 billion Hindus. You've got about 450, 500 million Buddhists. Who knows what the exact number is, but more or less. You've got 1.5 billion people, and then you've got various indigenous cultures around the planet, the Inuits, the various other tribes around. You've probably got about 25-30% of the world's population who have a cultural belief in reincarnation. That doesn't mean it's true, but it means that there must be something going on in the back of people's minds. There must be a belief for some reason. There was a survey in 2006, which was done by a Belgian university in Europe, and they came up with the statistic that about 27-28% of people believe in reincarnation across Europe. Iceland, incidentally, had a belief of about 40-45% of people, but who knows why that might be. Long dark nights, perhaps, nothing else to do. Anyway, so there is a bit of, there's a bit of background there, cultural background. It doesn't make it true. Are past lives real is a question that I often get asked. And I say, and this is your question from earlier, I say there's about 5 possible explanations for past lives. One, of course, is that it's reincarnation, that it's true, it's karmic rebirth, whatever words you want to use at that point. The second one is that it's ancestral memory, that it's DNA memory. We are a product of our parents' DNA. So, and science is getting to the point where it now understands that we carry about 7 generations of memories within our DNA. So who's to say that a past life experience that Neil has is not something that his great-great-great-grandfather actually experienced, for example? And there's actually no way to prove it one way or the other, sorry, but there's no proof to say, yes, that was a past life that you had rather than your great-great-great-grandfather. But it's a possible explanation for past lives. Another one is what the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung called the collective unconscious. And the theory is that when we go into what's called a past life regression, then we're actually almost like trying on a suit of clothes that's sitting in the collective unconscious, the memories of everyone who's ever lived. And it's another possible explanation. It explains to some degree one of the big criticisms of regression is that, oh, people always have famous lives. They're always Cleopatra, they're always Mary Magdalene, they're always whatever. But it's a possible explanation for why people do that. We go into the collective unconscious rather than our own personal unconscious. I read somewhere, and I'm going back probably 6 years, that there were 11,000 people who regressed to the life of Mary Magdalene. I've had 4. 2 of them bawled their eyes out for about 2 hours over the loss of a loved one, which actually related really well to their current life. It was actually very helpful for them. I had an Elizabeth I about 5 years ago. I was doing a talk like this in London, and I'd done my talk and I'd explained, I said, you know, when you go into these lives of famous people, it's not necessarily true. It's almost like an archetypal memory. It's a memory from the collective subconscious. And this lady at the back stood up at the end of the talk, and she started doing this louder and louder and louder until everyone in the room stopped talking, and she had everyone's attention. She said, I was Elizabeth I, you know. I said, that's fine. And I said, you know, I explained again about collective unconscious and archetypal memories. And she said, no. You don't understand. I was Elizabeth I, and I need to see you about that. And so she came along for a regression about 2 or 3 weeks later. And unsurprisingly, when she went into the experience, she started talking about the life of Elizabeth I. And she went through a couple of episodes of the life, but what she focused on was the relationship between Elizabeth and her half-sister Mary, Queen of Scots. And of course, if you know your history book, then Elizabeth basically signed the warrant for Mary, Queen of Scots to be beheaded. And this was very much a focal point of the regression. And what we do with regression is, most of the time, we're exploring the life, and then we're moving on beyond the life to actually do a bit of resolution for what's just happened. So we spent a bit of time doing resolution for the relationship between Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots. So anyway, the lady came out of the regression and she said, told you so. Told you I was Elizabeth I. And I said, fair enough. Now, what was interesting was that a week later, she sent me an email and said, thanks for that. I really enjoyed the experience. It was great. And by the way, my brother, who I haven't spoken to for 5 years, has just got back in touch. So at that point, what are you doing? Or what's happened? You don't really know whether this is coincidence, synchronicity, or whether the fact that she's mended a relationship with a sibling within her subconscious has allowed the relationship with the sibling to mend in reality. And, you know, from my role as a therapist, it doesn't really matter. The fact that she's got a result is the important thing. Now, she could have, for all I know, she could have studied the life of Elizabeth I. She was pretty good on detail. Not everybody's big on detail. She was pretty good on detail, but she came up with one interesting thing. And during the life, she had a baby. Okay, and we know Elizabeth I most commonly as being the Virgin Queen, right? She went childless, there were no heirs, etc., etc., etc. Nonetheless, she had a baby in the regression, or talked about having a baby. And about 6 months later, she sent me an article from the Daily Mail or Daily Express or one of those newspapers saying, it is believed Elizabeth I may have had a baby by one of her courtiers. So who knows whether she just knew her history, or whether she was tapping into the collective unconscious, or whether she was Elizabeth I. But so that's one of the possible explanations for past lives. Another one, and it really is a critic's favourite, is that when we go into what's called a past life, our subconscious mind pieces together a film that we saw on TV, a book that we read 5 years ago, and it's called cryptomnesia, where we just pull all these bits together to come up with a story that has some sort of grounding, some sort of reality that's plausible. And, to be honest with you, with all the people that I've worked with over the years, I can safely say that all of those explanations are true. And the other one that I forgot was that sometimes our subconscious creates a metaphorical experience for something that we actually don't want to look at quite directly in our everyday life. All of those things are true. I've seen them all pan out before me. I've had various famous people over the years, if you like, and I remember, I'll talk about that. I remember having a kid who came along, and he must have been 30 at the time, and he went into the life of Freddie Mercury. And, when I was younger, I was a bit of a Queen fan, not a big Queen fan, but, as soon as he left, I had to do the maths, and that's not possible. Simply not possible. I think he was just a kid who had, I call him a kid, he was a man, who had a fascination with Freddie Mercury and somehow wanted to connect into the energy of Freddie Mercury. There were certain things that, I didn't know about Freddie Mercury that he came up with, but, you never quite know what's happening in front of you. But I've seen all of those things happen, and what I can safely say is I'm a big believer in past lives. Some of the things I've seen, some of the stories I've heard, some evidential-based things that have come up through people that I've worked with, have convinced me that it's true, but it doesn't actually need to be. I remember 4 or 5 years ago, I had this young Irish lady who came along, and she'd been sending me emails for about 6 months saying, I really need to have a past life regression. I really need to have a past life regression. And then she was a very much an Irish Catholic. So it was very much contrary to traditional religious beliefs. And I think in the second month that she'd been sending me emails, her granny had died. So she saw this as a sign that she shouldn't actually do this past life regression thing. But anyway, eventually she came, because the reason why she came was because she had a really bad phobia of water. It would scare the life out of her. Forget about baths, just going in the shower was bad enough every morning, yeah? So she would have a bit of a panic attack, and it was quite hard, and she lived with her sister, and her sister would have to be there while she was going in the shower, and life was pretty difficult. And so anyway, she was so anxious about the whole experience when she came, and she sat opposite me, like you're sitting opposite me now. And I could see that the anxiety was actually, of course, it was part of the symptom, but it was also part of the experience that she'd had in the past. And anyway, it was actually quite easy for me, because sometimes we use the symptoms that are presenting, like the anxiety, as a way to get them back into the experience. Forget about hypnosis. Sometimes the anxiety or the sadness or whatever it might be is so strong that we can literally just push them back into the life. And she was on a big ship in the North Atlantic within a few minutes. And, you know the story. The big ship hit a big iceberg. And I thought, this girl's taken so long to get to me to have this session. She's going to disbelieve this. And I don't normally bother trying to get details, but I said, what do they call you? What do they call you? What do your family call you? And she gave me a name. And so afterwards, what we did was we Googled the name, and sure enough, there she was on the list of the dead for the Titanic. I never used the word Titanic during the regression. She never used the word Titanic because she was a little girl. She was 3 or 4 years old, so I wasn't even going to put my input into it. It was pretty clear what was happening, but we actually verified that. And that was actually, it was nice for her coming along from such a cynical position in life. And the water phobia, that was no more. It really was no more. And, I'm going to talk about a few more things like that where, real life symptoms have just disappeared as a result of going through these experiences again and then processing them. But I'm just going to stop for a glug of water. And if there are any questions while I'm stopping for a glug of water, then please do feel free.
You mentioned the fact that this chap say he could have been Freddie Mercury. Is there any kind of thing of a temporal linear nature? Or do you think you could be jumping around a different person?
I don't believe in time. I believe in time as a concept that we have to have on this planet in order to understand reality. I believe that when we go into whatever you want to call it, into the universe, into the spirit world, there is no time, or time is a very different thing to how we experience it here. So, although I present I'm presenting it in that way to sort of present my story. I didn't quite believe that he'd been Freddie Mercury anyway, but it's possible there could have been an overlap in that sense. Yeah.
Because I'd imagine, if everything was in a sequence, you could get this point where, if you're a spiritualist, sort of calling someone up, sorry, this is already in another body somewhere else, you can't talk to him.
There is a concept, of course, that you may have heard of called parallel lives, where the soul actually splits its energy and comes into two bodies at the same time. There's a book, I don't know whether anybody's read The Journey of Souls by a bloke called Michael Newton, who did a lot of work in what's called the life between life space, where before we come into incarnation. And in that, he did lots and lots of case studies and talked about them. And he talked about a bloke who was living in North America somewhere, can't quite remember where, and Canada at the same time period. And it was the same soul that was incarnated. And let's say it was a Canadian, came for a regression at that point and talked about that part of his soul being in North America. Whether they met after that, I have no idea, but it could have been quite funky if they did. But, I would see that as a possibility. The more I kind of think about stuff and work with people like that, I tend not to rule out anything, to be honest with you.
Where does that fit then, like, say, with twins? Sort of, say, for example, identical twins.
I don't know the answer to that question. That's a great question. I've never worked with twins.
Because I've actually got something that one day I will find out. I won't find out now, but I will find out later. Because apparently I was part of a twin. And the other half died.
In the womb?
Yeah, and it wasn't found out till I was born.
Ah, okay.
And also, I've been told something looking like me on the other side of the room.
Okay, I've worked with that. That's a phenomenon that's not unheard of. It's not common, but it's called the lost twin. And often, for example, a friend of mine who lives in Switzerland had that phenomenon where, there were, it would have been twins in the womb together, and the twin basically left, and she spent a lot of her life feeling abandoned. That was a big theme for her in all of her life.
That word has come up, abandoned.
Yeah, because it's a very primeval feeling.
And also the other fact is, apparently a deal was made. I'm waiting for that one.
Do you know what the deal is?
Okay, I don't know what the deal is.
Okay.
I've actually got another question.
Yeah, just to sort of round up on that one, identical twins fascinates me all of a sudden. I'm assuming, should never assume, I'm assuming it's the same soul, but it might not be. It might be, no, it's probably different souls thinking it through.
It's got to be a concept where you come down to a certain point and then some have to split. Depends how far you're coming down.
It could be two souls simply agreeing to incarnate at the same time. Could be as simple as that. Same as two people going to the pub at the same time. Same principle. Could be. Anyway, sorry, what's your second question?
The second question is, do you know anything about birth, Mark?
Yes, I'm going to talk about that. Hold your horses on that one, yeah. So, what was I talking about? I was talking about theories of reincarnation or possibilities for reincarnation being true. And as I say, I've seen all of those things, but I'm a firm believer. I think there's much more to this. Evidence, I'm going to come on to evidence. And of course, there is no evidence as such, apart from anecdotal evidence. More and more therapists are having little stories like my Titanic story. I've had a lady who identified villages in Africa that she couldn't possibly have known about and found them on Google Maps. I've had various little assortments over the years. There was a therapist called Peter Ramster who worked in Australia many years ago, and he was obviously regressing Australian people. And what he did was, as part of the process, he brought him over to two of his best cases. He brought him over to the UK and France to actually relive physically the experience that they'd had in regression. And one of the ladies whose story I don't remember quite so well was she'd been around the time of the French Revolution. So they took her around the outskirts of Paris, and she was able to identify the chateau where they'd come from. And as soon as they took her into central Paris, then she started to get very twitchy, because that was the point where they'd taken her to with the head. And so there was a certain amount of, his story goes into much more detail than I've just told it. But the other girl whose story I remember a bit better had been in Glastonbury sometime shortly after the dissolution of the monastery. So that would have been shortly after Henry VIII. So that's a better historian than me can tell me what date that was, but 1500 and something. 1500 and something. So 500 years earlier, and she'd lived in Glastonbury, and so she was sort of moping, if you like, around the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey at the time, and that was part of the life experience. But she lived in a set of cottages, or in a cottage that was part of a set of cottages, say half a mile from Glastonbury Abbey. And what they were able to do, Ramster took her back, or she was able to lead them to where this cottage was. She knew exactly where it was once they'd got her to the Abbey, and she was able to take her back on the way she used to walk home. And they found what they believed to be the cottage, and it was being used as a pigsty. Now, in the regression, she described the floor tile in the cottage. There was some sort of mosaic on the floor tile. So they went into the pigsty and they scraped away everything that was on the floor of the pigsty, and they found the tile that she described, which was just fabulous, yeah? So every so often you get stuff like that, which you can say, yeah, that sounds true. Another source of evidence is kids. And there was a professor who was working at the University of Virginia called Ian Stevenson. And way back in the early 60s, Stevenson was given a grant by the people who invented the Xerox photocopying machine of $1 million, £1 million, whatever it was, to go out and investigate reincarnation. So Stevenson decided, because he's a very scientific man, so he decided that, okay, if I'm going to do this, I need to do it properly. I'm going to go into areas and investigate ages where they haven't been influenced by the media too much. So he went out into Asia, where obviously much less media than there is 50 years ago, and he started working with kids. And of course, there was also a cultural belief in reincarnation in lots of parts of Asia. So he went out and he investigated, altogether, he investigated thousands of cases with his team, and he wrote up 2,600 of them altogether. And his books, don't even bother trying to read them because they're like so boring, it's unbelievable. But they're proper scientific investigations. Of that, one of his more manageable books, 20 Suggested Cases of Reincarnation, took kind of his best stories. And one of them that springs to mind was a little girl called Svanlata. And Svanlata was 7 years old in India when she was sitting in her dad's car, and her dad was a real estate agent. And she said, at the end of the day, 4 o'clock, she said, "Daddy, I want to go home." And so her dad started driving the car in the direction of home, and she said, no, not that home, the other home. And so a whole story sprung up out of that comment. And what they discovered, that Swarnlata Mishra, I think her name was, had the memories of being a lady called B. Parthak, who'd been in a village 100 miles away and had died 7 years previously to Swarnlata being born. So Stevenson's team investigated it quite scientifically, and they did little tests on the little girl and asked her questions. And at some point, they took her to the village where she claimed to have lived before, and they let her lead them around the village, and she said, well, this is the place where the cow was killed, and this is where my aunt got married, and this and that. And they introduced her to a group of people, and she said, well, that's my cousin, and that's my husband. And that bloke I don't know at all. Don't know, never met him, don't think he was part of my family. And anyway, all the people they introduced her to, they'd actually put in some ringers to try and test her, and she got every single one right. And so they did various other tests, and at the end of it, they came up and they said, well, there are 49 separate objective pieces of evidence that suggest this must be a case of reincarnation. But being scientists, we can't say it is. Yeah. And what was interesting, she indeed had a husband living. The character she claimed to be had a husband living. And she had grown-up sons. She had like 35, 40-year-old sons. And she, this little girl, went up to the husband and said, I know what you did. And it turned out that what the husband had done was he'd taken some money from a secret place that only him and his wife knew about. And so for the family, the husband and his grown-up sons, this was evidence that this must be the reincarnation of his dead wife. And actually, bizarrely enough, the two families got on famously after that. But, so that was one of Stevenson's best cases. But kids over the years they come out with stuff quite spontaneously, and a lot of those cases got investigated by Stevenson years ago. He died about 7 or 8 years ago, but his work is still being done by a guy called Jim Tucker, who started off as a child psychologist and is still investigating stuff. And if you go on YouTube and look at Jim Tucker or Ian Stevenson, you find quite a lot of their stories. And I saw Jim Tucker speak at a conference a few years ago, and basically what he said was, we get so many letters from people's parents saying that their child has started talking about this period in history or this or that. He said, we simply don't have the resources to even begin to investigate more than about 1% of them. But there are so many people who are coming forward. We choose what we think are going to be the best stories, the best proof, but it's pot luck, really. And you can see there's talking of Scottish Islands. Neil was talking of Scottish Islands before we started, and there's one little boy who remembers being on Scottish Island. There's a lovely story it's about a 10-minute video on YouTube of Jim Tucker takes him back to the Scottish Island, and the little boy remembers, and there's tears and all that sort of thing. But one of the other good stories that came out of children was there was a boy, I'm going to remember his name in a second, there was a boy who woke up screaming every night when he was about 3 years old. And he said, little man can't get out, little man can't get out. And this was his consistent nightmare. And anyway, his dad was, and this was in America, his dad was a fundamentalist Christian. So very strong beliefs there. But his gran had a belief for some reason in reincarnation. His gran sort of suggested that this must be something that was coming from a past life. And one way or another, they got the little boy to a past life regression therapist. But what he'd been doing up until that point was drawing pictures of Second World War aircraft. And basically, the little man couldn't get out of the cockpit on the on the fighter plane in the Second World War, and that was how he died. And his past life name was James Houston III Jr. It'll come to me in a little while what his current life name was. But anyway, so it turned out, I mean, this little boy, he had little model planes that his parents had bought him, and his mum would say, "Oh, look, a bomb's dropped off," and he'd say, "No, Mum, that's not a bomb. That's a fuel tank." You know, this is a 3 or 4 year old kid saying these things, yeah? And what happened was that actually his Christian fundamentalist father ended up doing the investigation, and they traced back to the aircraft carrier that he'd been on in the Second World War, and they worked out pretty much where he died. And then they hit a major discrepancy, because I can't remember the type of fighter plane that it was, but let's call it a Mustang, because that's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. They had 4 Mustangs, and they said these 4 Mustangs have been shot down from this aircraft carrier on this day. And they said, no, that aircraft carrier didn't have any Mustangs on it. And so they said, this must be complete rubbish. Can't be true. And anyway, somebody did a bit more research, and they discovered that by a pure fluke, it just so happened that these 4 Mustangs had been on that aircraft carrier on that day when that little boy had died in his past life. And what was quite interesting as well was the therapist, when he worked with the therapist, you work in a very different way with kids. And a lot of his have been about drawing pictures and, sort of expressing his deepest fears. And he'd drawn a picture of him getting out of the aircraft and 4 people above him. And his therapist had said to him, "Who are these 4 people?" And he said, "Well, that's Bob, Chuck, Dave, and Bill." And he said, "Who were they?" He said, "They met me when I went to heaven." And it turned out that Bob, Chuck, Dave, and Bill had been people on the same aircraft carrier who died a couple of weeks before him. So, interesting. It's called Soul Survivor on YouTube. Oh, James Leininger is the name of the little boy. But it's a fascinating little video, and it's a true story. So there's these little bits of evidence around. I remember somebody who was a student of mine a few years ago, and she had 2 boys at the time. They were about 6 and 8, and the youngest one was doing a school project, and she'd had a series of regressions during her training, and she'd been Lady somebody or another in the Tudor period. And it just so happened her kid was doing a school project for the Tudors. And so the parents had to go to the school, and they had to look around all, not just their own child's project, but all the projects that all the little children had done. And so she went and looked at her own child's project, said, "Oh, that's lovely," and all the right things. And then she saw that another kid had done a project on Lady Blah Blah. And so she went over there and she looked at Lady Blah Blah. And her child came over to her and said, "Why are you looking at that, Mummy?" And she said, "Well, she told her child nothing about her regression experience. And she said, "I just find this kind of thing interesting. That lady's story was interesting." He said, "You don't need to know about that, Mum. You were that lady." And things like that, just coming from the mind of a child, unfiltered, is kind of interesting. So it's evidence in inverted commas, if you like. The other area of potential evidence, again, it's something you were starting to talk about before we began, is near-death experiences in the States. There was a big phase of that in the 70s. People like Raymond Moody, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and Kenneth Ring did a lot of documenting about what would happen when people basically have a near-death experience. There's a big resurgence of that over the past, probably starting about 10 or 12 years ago, because there was a guy who worked in Southampton at the time. He worked in a Southampton hospital called Sam Parnia. He was a doctor. And they started to call him the Resurrection Doctor, because what Sam Parnia had pioneered was a machine to give people, what's it called when you resuscitate? Resuscitation. He developed a machine for that rather than a human being doing it. It turns out that just using a very simple machine increases your chances of recovering from that. So actually, if you have a heart attack, have it in one of his hospitals rather than somebody else's hospitals. But anyway, his whole interest had developed in resuscitation because he'd had a little boy who he'd had to resuscitate. And this little boy who'd been brought back to life by him had drawn him a picture to say thank you. And on the picture there was this cord coming out of the little boy's head. And so the doctor said, what's that? And the little boy said, well, that's my silver cord. That's why I didn't die, because the silver cord wasn't broken. So he said, tell me more. And that started his whole area of research into what happens when people go out of the body during a near-death experience. And what he did was, interestingly enough, he set up something called the Horizon Research Institute, and they did a series of experiments in 10 UK hospitals and 10 US hospitals, and they put things on the top of tall cabinets. When people were going into the theatre or wherever it were that where they were doing the operations, they hadn't seen anything, any of the tools. They didn't know the names of any of the people, so they could only describe what happened or who the people were, who the tools were that were being used from a perspective of being out of the body. The whole idea was to capture out-of-body evidence. And interestingly, the results of the Horizon Research Institute should have been published 2 years ago, but for some reason, they never actually made it into press, which is a little bit intriguing. But there was quite a lot of research around that sort of area. I don't know whether anybody read a book by a lady called Anita Moorjani called Dying to Be Me. Anita was a lady who was dying of a very severe form of either leukemia or cancer. She went into hospital to die with tumours the size of melons, and her weight had got lemons. Her weight had gone down to about 4.5 stone. And in the hospital, she had a near-death experience and spontaneously recovered under doctor supervision. And her whole experience is documented in the book. And you know, near-death experience, what really happens with near-death experiences is what they're looking for when they investigate them is they're looking for what's called the core experience. And the core experience is really leaving the body, but going into, perhaps through a tunnel, going into a place which appears to be the light, in inverted commas, and meeting your ancestors or your family or whatever. And that's what they're looking for, who can tick as many of those boxes as possible to have what's called a core experience. And, you know, the similarities between the near-death experience, why it's interesting for regression is because that's what happens after people have a past life. They go through the death point and they go into a place beyond that life. So there's a lot of similarities there with the passing from the body. Yeah. So again, you could call it very circumstantial evidence, but nonetheless, it's the closest we get to evidence in an area that's difficult to evidence. So I'm just going to pause again just for a second and just see whether there's any questions while I'm having a bit of water.
Have you had any cases where people have read books on manuscripts and then had like a vision or an experience from reading something that might suggest that some previous existence?
Yes, a trigger of some description, yeah.
Can you give me some examples of that?
Tell me the book by Kate Moss that was set in France in the Cathar time. It was a big, thick book. It was about that thick. and called Labyrinth. Labyrinth, is that right? Labyrinth with an E on the end. And I had about 3 people who came ended up going back to the Cathar time because that had triggered some kind of memory in them about.
Have anybody that's actually read a book, they've seen something as a consequence of reading a book, of a vision or like an apparition or anything like that, the thing of reading the book has actually triggered an actual thing that they've actually seen?
It triggered something with all 3 of those people. They had dreams. They had dreams about dying. If you know the stories of the Cathars, the Cathars were basically destroyed by the Catholic Church at Montségur. Yeah. And all 3 of those people they had dreams about, actually one of them was burnt and 2 of them were thrown off of Montségur mountain. And they had dreams about that. And they didn't know each other. There were 3 completely different people over the course of about 2 years who came and said, I've read Kate Moss's book and it's triggered something in me. I've never read the book, so I don't know whether they talk about Montségur, but that was the trigger for them. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, and I probably had a few of those. I mean, I remember there was a lady who used to live in, she's now passed on, but there was a lady who used to live in Glastonbury who called herself Isis. And every year she used to run a trip to Egypt and take a whole bunch of people and do wonderful things with them around the pyramids and all sorts of things. And I knew somebody who used to go on those trips. And as a result of those trips, I'd have all these people coming back to me going, I have this terrible experience. So they all go into these Egyptian lives. I used to regularly get clients out of that. So yes, I mean, things can trigger people quite easily.
I'm curious about it, because when I was a kid, I went to the library and I was a 7-year-old, 8-year-old. And I came from a Catholic background in Norfolk, no experience at all of other cultures outside of Norfolk really, and took a book of ancient Indian Vedic scripture. Read this book with great interest, and then I saw this in front of me, just like a woman dancing in fire with other animals in circles of fire, and I didn't know at the time, until many years later, it was one of those mandala things.
Yep, mandala. Yep.
Yeah, with the circle of life and death, basically. But of course, that was something I actually saw and illuminated this very dark world, and I could see it, and I was amazed by it. I didn't know what the heck it was, and I just wonder if maybe that book maybe triggered something. I don't know. It's
For sure.
a history in my life, and I've got a very open mind about it. But I've got a very, very strong pull now to go to India. I've never been, and I've not had a chance.
I have one word for you. Go.
Go. Yeah, but it's intriguing to me. It's been one of those sort of mysteries in my life. Kind of, I wonder what that's about. I'm kind of interested to know if people have had.
Yeah, I mean that's common with me, my friends, people that come. Yeah, it's we have things that trigger us all the time. Everything is memory. Certain songs that you hear on the radio are going to remind you of certain times in your life. Certain smells are going to remind you of certain periods in your life. Everything is a trigger. Now we're sitting here, we're thinking, okay, we're this body that was born however many years ago, and we've lived till this point in time. But what if our subconscious holds the memory of our soul lineage? Yeah, and so certain triggers, like the books that you're talking about, or maybe you hear, Ravi Shankar playing the sitar, it's going to trigger something Indian in you. I mean, I ever since I was a kid, I just give you a few stories about me. Sorry? Okay.
I just wonder if there's something that actually people have actually physically seen after reading.
Yeah, I mean, seeing is part of it, but it's not the only sense, of course. So it doesn't have to be a vision. I grew up. When I went to senior school at 11, I was really, really good at French for the first few years. And I remember coming back after 6 or 9 months, and I got an A for French at the end of my first year. And I remember my mum commenting, and I said, "It's all thanks for you for teaching me French when I was younger." And she was like, "I didn't teach you French. Where'd you get that from?" And I was convinced I'd learned French before I went to senior school. I hadn't, but I knew it, and I knew it just, and I know I've had past lives in France. What did you want to do? And this is a question to all of you. What did you want to do when you grew up? What games did you play when you were a kid? Because if I tell you about the evidence of little children remembering their past lives more easily, what's happening there when you're a little kid? Often the games you play or what you want to do are like what I call bleed-throughs from past lives. Just to give you an example, I wanted to be a pilot. I made model aircraft, little Airfix models with my dad, and I painted them. I read Biggles books, I read books about the war, I read everything I could find until I read Douglas Bader's story where he got his legs amputated, and that put me off completely. But but lo and behold, I had a life where I was in the war. And I've experienced that, and I know that I died in an aeroplane. Which is why I had a fear of flying for many years in the current life. So often when we're a little kid, before we start to get conditioned by what society expects us to do, we have the natural, and this can be you when you're picking up a book about the Vedic scriptures. I mean, who would do that when they're 7 or 8 or whatever you said, unless there's a trigger for it. So often we've got these little bleed-throughs in our current life that tell us a little bit about who we were.
I wouldn't say that it was a bad thing, because actually it was like the thing that, whatever it was, or whatever the explanation is, it sort of got me to do something from the spiritual point. So it's not a bad thing, and I don't think always, sometimes I didn't think about people say that they believe in past life, and they always connect it with trauma, being famous and having your head chopped off, but it's not always the case. I think it can actually be a positive, if you believe that, it could be a positive thing.
It's not always the case. I mean, I say to people that, if you take a random number and you say you've lived 100 past lives, for example, and let's call them books, let's use the metaphor of books to describe those lives, 70 or 80 of them are fine. They're done and dusted and they're sitting on the bookshelf. It's the 20 or 30 that are sitting on the floor in varying degrees of completion that are still causing the problem. So the bulk of them are fine, are good, but it's the ones we haven't finished. And this is probably what I was going to talk about the most, but I haven't quite got around to it yet. It's how do past lives affect the current life? It's the lives we haven't finished. It's how we die at the end of those lives. It's what I call the soul's unfinished business. I don't call it, everybody calls it the soul's unfinished business. So it's where we haven't got closure. It's where we haven't processed the emotions. It's where we've got thoughts which are still bouncing around our head. And it can even be, to come back to your point earlier, where we've had a physical wound which may or may not result in a bad knee in this life or something else, or possibly a birthmark. The other area of Ian Stevenson's research was where biology meets reincarnation, and he investigated birthmarks on people and how it could relate to past lives. But I'll come back to that in a second. So, how we die and the various degrees of incompletion of dying will often determine what the soul will choose to come back and work on in the next life. So if you've got a problem forgiving the soul that was your brother in the previous life, it could be pretty likely that you'll be with that same brother. He may not be your brother, he may be your mother, he may be your sister, he may be your son. You're going to have issues with him that are going to bring you to a point where your soul will try and suggest that you might want to forgive him for being whatever he is or doing whatever he does, yeah? The soul is always going to want to get completion for what it is that we haven't worked with. And I do a lot of work with things like phobias, for example. Phobias is just one area that I work with where people come along and they work with, they've got a fear of spiders. They've got a fear of snakes. Part of the component of phobia is that it's quite irrational, and the irrationality of that is that we don't have any poisonous snakes in this country, so actually there's nothing to be afraid of. And the biggest spider you're going to find is about that big. Yeah, so it's completely irrational. However, for anyone who's got the phobia, it's awful. It's absolutely awful. So where does that come from? We don't always need to find out where it comes from. In hypnosis, you can often put a Band-Aid on it and it's fine for the rest of your life. But sometimes when people have got really severe phobias, you actually need to unlock the story and to find out the source of the phobia. Every phobia is going to have started from somewhere. What's a phobia? It's a very deep-rooted fear of something. And it suggests that you're going to avoid something whenever you possibly can. So one of the areas that I work with is phobias, for example, because often we've died being, it's using a really silly example, but being bitten by the snake or the spider or whatever it is, yeah? And so we have a deep-rooted fear of them locked into our subconscious. So it really is about, the fear of water for the Titanic girl was a very natural fear. And we have all these, if you look back at history and you think about all these crazy ways that people have died or been killed over the years, you can understand why we have you can understand why there are so many damn therapists about these days. Stuff can be literal and stuff can be metaphorical. I worked with a lady a few years ago, and it was almost a carbon copy of one of my teacher's stories, and I was amazed, but that was how it came out. And this lady said, I have a problem with men in my life. And I quite often get women coming to me saying that kind of thing. This particular lady said, my father was a bully. I married a bully. And I've got a boss for a bully after I got divorced. And she said, come on. And, I work in the current life as well as past life. So we did a bit of work with the father relationship. We did a bit of work with the husband relationship in sessions 1 and session 2. And in the third session, she came along and she went into a life where she was in the Spanish Inquisition and she was being tortured. And it wasn't that pleasant, to be honest with you. What she described was having her guts pulled out of her body. And what we do in regression is we basically, after the life is over, we will transform the life. We'll want to put things right. So actually what it's called is psychodrama or hypnodrama. We get her to put her guts back in to the body to make the energy body, the etheric body around the physical body whole again. And so when the session was over, she said, what the hell was that all about? She said, how does that possibly relate to my story with men? And I looked at her and said, well, what did you just do? She said, well, I just got my guts back. And then it dawned on her. But actually, she had the guts to go and stand up to her boss, who was going to get it in the neck, clearly, the very next day. And she didn't. Actually, she went in and she said, I'm working so hard, I'd like a pay rise, and this is because I'm doing these and these hours, and her boss gave her a pay rise. But it was the first time she'd ever stood up to a man properly because she'd got her guts back. So it was very much metaphorical, and it was, Sorry, Neil, could you do me a favour and just grab me a water?
Qualifications that just unfortunately to cut some out because we go into this area, and I'm interested to know what actually you do in the hypnotherapy to regress people. How do you do that? Do you do it just as a standard case of hypnotherapy, or is there any special element to it?
No, I mean, has anybody here ever had hypnosis? Anybody think it's voodoo? You know, we go into a state of hypnosis just to demystify it completely, yeah? We go into a state of hypnosis several times a day, yeah? What happens, for example, have you ever driven somewhere that you go on a regular basis and you thought, how did I get here? You've done that because your subconscious mind does it automatically. It's a hypnotic state, yeah? Thank you, Neil. Have you ever read a book, or more commonly these days, looked at your phone to the exclusion of anything else so that somebody was calling your name and you haven't heard it? That's a fixed state of attention. It's similar to a hypnotic state. When you go to bed at night, what happens just before you go to sleep is when you're half awake and you're half asleep, you're in the hypnagogic state. Again, similar to a state of hypnosis, where you might hear the cat knocking the dustbin lid off the dustbin next door, but you're not that bothered with it, i.e. you've got diminished peripheral awareness, and what's actually happening is your brain waves are slowing down, and you're moving from what's called the beta state of everyday interaction into what's called alpha and theta states, which are states of meditation. That's all hypnosis is. So we're doing it all the time. Daydreaming is a hypnotic state. Sitting in front of the TV is a hypnotic state. It's why advertisers pay so much money for big sporting events, because they know a bunch of blokes drinking beer are going to be going... You know, so we use hypnosis, yes, and hypnosis is actually, I teach courses on hypnosis. Hypnosis is an amazing modality. It's not rocket science. Actually, what's most important is an ability to understand people and to be empathic with people and to work with people.
So the line of questioning while they're in the hypnotic state is
open-ended questions. Never ever ask leading questions, because that will put doubt into the mind of the client that they have a genuine experience. So, for example, there's no way I'm going to say, is that the Titanic? Yeah? I'm going to say, okay. Does that ship have a name? I didn't even ask that, to be honest with you. Didn't want to go there. But, you're as non-leading as you possibly can be. You're always allowing them to create. What are they creating from? When you have a daydream, what's that? It's your imagination, isn't it? It's what Carl Jung called the language of the soul. When we go there's a French guy whose name I can't remember, who's done loads of work on what he calls the imaginal realms, and it's the realms of the imagination. So when we go into a past life experience, our inner senses are creating that for us. We're imagining it. Now, imagination is different from fantasy, where we're making it up. Our imagination is the way we can process the language of the soul. Things that you think you've imagined. I don't know whether your paranormal group has ever done things like spirit hunts and things like that. But often when you imagine things, there's probably a bit of reality to it, because it's something beyond the realm of our ordinary five senses which is picking it up on it. We've all got a gut instinct, for example. Sometimes we think we're imagining stuff. We're not. Kids with imaginary friends. So our imagination is actually a very positive force for processing. What we're doing is we're unlocking something in our subconscious. First time I ever had a proper past life regression, I wasn't especially visual at the time. I still don't really see movies. But what would happen as I was being hypnotized was I was relaxing, my body was relaxing, and I was, I hypnotize quite well these days, but anyway, in those days it was a bit of a longer process, and the first thing I noticed was this horrible smell. I'm like, what the hell is that? And I was convinced. I was you still have conscious awareness of where you are, and part of my brain is going, who's left a rotting sandwich in the room? And then I suddenly occurred to me that this smell was taking me into the memory. And it wasn't a particularly positive memory, but I was dying on a battlefield in Napoleon's army somewhere in the 1800s. But it was a smell that unlocked my imagination. And then I just knew the story. I don't know where the story came from. I couldn't even begin. Well, I do know where the story came from. But at the time, I was just like, I don't know what I'm saying. But the story came. And so we're unlocking the imagination for past life experiences. That's really how it flows. It's like, simple hypnosis, for example. It's simple relaxation techniques are not that different from guided imagery, guided meditations. It's a very similar principle. In terms of getting past life stuff out, there's obviously a lot more to it than that. It's about how we can guide an experience, how we can get the client to go through the death point, which isn't always so easy, and how we can get them to be in the body. It's a very different thing to processing something through our head on the mental level. Generally, what we're holding on to will have a strong emotional component. And so the only way that emotional component can be accessed is by getting them to imagine being back in that body. Because then when we go through something, we can release it. And, frankly, as a regression therapist, I should have bought tears in Kleenex years ago because, I get a lot of tears, a lot of emotion coming out. And, often that's the issue. It's emotion that wasn't released at the time. It's not always pretty stories. But of course, as you said earlier, there are good lives and there are bad lives. Generally, when I get people coming to me with problems, it ain't going to be the good lives that they've got to look at. It's going to be the ones where something ended badly, where they did something wrong.
Yeah, so it kind of skews you towards thinking in a certain way. You're only getting a certain proportion of people because of the nature of the job is to help people with problems. But the majority of people might not have that.
Your audience as a therapist is very limited if you're only looking for people who want to access positive past life experiences. Often I get people who've been to 70. I could tell you the story. I remember doing a workshop in London years ago, and there was this lady there. And what I used to do in that workshop was I sort of do a few exercises during the day, a bit of talking, and at the end of the day, I'd draw straws to pick a demo. And so this lady got picked, and she said, right, now you got a problem. And anyway, she hadn't been able to move her neck more than this much for 17 years or something crazy. And she'd been to the chiropractor, she'd been to the osteopath, she'd been to the neck doctor, she'd been to the herbalist, you name it, she'd been there, yeah? And she'd been hung in a past life. All I had to do was get the rope off. I make that sound gloriously simple, but it isn't. But that was what had to happen. The rope had to come off because the rope got stuck there in the past life.
You deal with phobias and connections with people having traumatic experiences and you release them from that. But do you have anybody go to you that say that they just want to get access the potential of the previous knowledge and wisdom and experiences of previous life? Do you ever have any of that? Anybody that actually comes along and says, actually, I don't think I've got a problem. I just want to access a lot of information that I picked up.
It does happen. Generally, it's not always so tangible for them. I've had a couple of, I've a bunch of people over the years. I've had a person who was really interested in becoming a crystal healer. Went back to a life as a crystal healer in the past life. I had a lady who later became a herbalist who went back and was doing something in forests in Germany and collecting plants and all that kind of thing. I've had a bunch of them over the years. They're less common, to be honest with you, but you definitely can. But in terms of accessing wisdom, it's almost like you're doing a channeling session at that point. It's a little bit... It definitely happens. I have less of those people, to be honest with you.
What's the difference then between channeling and regression?
I could say nothing, but it wouldn't quite be accurate. But you're going into an altered state of consciousness where you're connecting with another personality, let's say. It could be your own past life personality, or it could be another past life personality, and you're accessing wisdom from that place. Go and see a channel. It's not that different from a medium that Neil was talking about earlier, but it tends to be more embodied when somebody is channeling something.
Having said that time is a concept, have you ever met or encountered, for use of a better term, a future life? Someone from the future?
I tend to refer, I do past lives, or I call things past lives because it's more recognized. In my head, I think of it as other lives, because you're never quite sure whether it could be a future thing. I did, future life progression is out there. I've done a bit of it. It's not that hard, to be honest with you. And I remember I did a thing a few years ago, and there was a girl who came along, and I did a group thing. A girl who came along who had a fear of hospitals. And she was due to go and have an operation in a few weeks for something or another. Anyway, she went into a future life experience, which was all a bit Star Trek. And they were doing in the hospitals. Whatever it was that was, but it was very space age. And she came out and said, yeah, I can do that. I can do the operation in the current life. Not a problem. That made things okay for her. Whether that was a real experience, I'll never know, but it could have been something that her mind was creating, which seemed very real for her. So yes, it does happen. Yeah. How are we doing on time, Neil? 9:30.
Oh gosh, blimey. Did you have a break and answer the questions? Yeah.
I'm not bothered. I'm, up to you guys. If you need a toilet break. Yeah.
Okay, so let's have a 15-minute break so that people can go to the loo, have cups of tea, coffees, or drinks and crisps, or even a past life. Quick 15-minute past life.
Try not to do it in the toilet though. Righto. So I wanted to talk about a bit of physical stuff. This gentleman over here had talked about birthmarks earlier, and I mentioned it briefly as part of Ian Stevenson's work. And as I was saying during the break, when Stevenson was doing his research, it was pretty much set up a stall in the market and say, right, who's got some past life stories? Which in Asia was, a bit of a nightmare because all sorts of people would turn up with all sorts of stories. But when they were collecting physical evidence, even, they'd have people turning up saying, I've been run over by a truck in a previous life. And they never quite know whether, somebody had rolled a tyre across their back that morning, or whether it was a genuine birthmark carryover from a previous life until they started trying to wash it off or whatever they try and do. But there were quite a few stories that came out of that. One of his most famous ones was there was a fellow that they'd traced back to his previous life. And in the current life, he had a big birthmark, pretty much the size of the palm of his hand. And what they'd found out was that he had been on a boat. I think it was America, probably America, maybe Canada. Not sure whether Canada have guns. But anyway, him and his mate had been out on a lake in the middle of nowhere in, let's say it was the 50s, something like that. And they'd been fishing. They must have been Americans because they were fishing with guns. And somehow the shotgun had gone off accidentally and blown a hole in this fella's hand. And so what his mate did was start to row the boat to shore, but he'd applied a tourniquet. And so he rowed the boat to shore, started to take his mate to the hospital, but what he didn't know was that every so often you have to release the pressure in a tourniquet. And as a result of not doing that, his mate had died. And so when he incarnated, there he was with the birthmark reminder of his hand. I've had a couple of people that I've worked with over the years. A friend of mine who used to organise my courses for me, she had a birthmark on her bum apparently. And she had a life with her ex-husband where and he's not a particularly nice bloke in this life, and he was like an Al Capone type figure in the past life, and she was his mole. I think that's the word, isn't it? The gangster's mole. And anyway, at some point, she was unfaithful to him. And this bloke had either come into the room where she was in action with her lover, or he'd sent some of his heavies in. And I guess it's like an old style shotgun where it had sprayed pellets. Yeah. And that was the birthmark that she had. So she'd got shot in the bum in the past life, and she carried the birthmark into this life. So they're my two best birthmark stories. But the physical stuff does carry through. One of the first people that I worked with, in fact, it was when I was doing my case studies many years ago for my training, and there was this Romanian girl called Isabella who came, and she was coming because of the relationship with her father. That was what she wanted to work on. But when I read her intake form, she said, I asked about medical conditions and all sorts of things. And she said, I have an internal bleed in my stomach. I'd never heard of that. And she said, oh, it's all right, it's not a problem. I go to the hospital and get it checked every 3 months to make sure it's not worse, but it's always been there. So anyway, we go into this past life, and the intention was to work on the relationship with the father. But what happened was that she was running through a jungle in her past life somewhere in the middle of Lord knows where, and she got either an arrow or a spear that went into just there. So what we did during the transformation part of it was I got her to simulate pulling it out. And 3 weeks later, when she went back to the hospital, nothing there. Nothing there at all. I could tell you about my friend Janet, who had asthma and was using her inhaler 12 times a day, who got burnt as a witch in a past life. My friend Janet is quite a character, and she's quite psychic, a very good medium actually. And so when she was describing her death scene, she was like, bloody hell, they're using the wrong type of wood and I'm inhaling this stuff. Don't they know? And anyway, this wrong type of wood produced these fumes which went into her lungs. And when she coughed, spluttered, cleared it out of her lungs in the regression, she sent me an email afterwards, and she said, I used my inhaler once on the train on the way home because it was like a habit of something I do, and I've never used it again since. That was 10 years ago. Her asthma just went. Another lady who was a student on a course had rheumatoid arthritis. She could barely, her words, could barely wipe her own bum. That's how bad it was in her hands. And we found her one day as a little boy in the stocks somewhere in medieval England, and she was being rotten fruit thrown at her, and somebody came along and went crack, crack, and that was seemingly the start of what she was carrying around in her hands for several hundred years. The physical stuff is a little bit more random in terms of the healing that comes out of it, because often people come for unexplainable back pain. They come for really serious physical stuff. And, sometimes, like the examples I've mentioned, there are healings, there are cures. Sometimes there is remission, but it's not always possible. Sometimes the soul's journey is actually not to recover from that stuff. It's actually to have that with us for the lifetime, for some of the emotional components that particular illness, disability, whatever it is, might bring us. And the learning is about living with the emotion, or experiencing the emotion, or dealing with the emotion from a different perspective. But, the physical stuff does get very interesting. The other thing I wanted to talk about before I pause and just stop for questions was just because you're the Paranormal Club or whatever you're called, I thought I'd talk about ghosts. What we find, as I said before, that the death point is really probably the most important point of a regression, because what we're looking for is the soul's unfinished business. And what we often find, or sometimes find, is that when the soul leaves behind the physical body, it fragments sometimes. And I mean, if you think about popular fiction, J.K. Rowling introduced this concept in Harry Potter of a soul which fragments, in a very bad way in that case, but it was induced by trauma. And that's what we're talking about here. The soul will fragment and leave behind a bit of the energy. So it means part of the soul energy is stuck somewhere. I mean, in shamanism, they talk about soul retrieval. They talk about going back to the place to get the soul back. And we end up doing that a lot. Sometimes what we find is that these bits of people's souls end up in people's energy fields, in people's auras. So actually clearing energy from people, clearing soul fragments from people's energy field, as wild and wacky as it may sound, is actually something quite common. I could tell you about a friend of mine who lives about 4 miles that way, who I'm not going to describe too much in case any of you know her. She came back from an overseas trip probably about 1.5 years ago. And I saw her about a week later, and she said, I've eaten something really, really, really bad. I've just had a bad stomach. Every night at 6 o'clock, I go to the toilet, and there's almost no point in eating anything. It just comes straight out of me. So I said, what are you doing about that? And she said, well, I'm going to the doctor's. About another week later, I saw her again. She said, still can't eat properly. Still can't. It's just coming out of me. And I said, so how'd you get on at the doctor's? She said, well, I got tablets, doing nothing, whatever. I don't know what she was taking. I'm not an expert on pills. Anyway, we go on to the 3rd week. And I said, have you thought about looking at this in a different way? She said, what do you mean? And I said, and she's very open to this kind of stuff. And I said, well, you go on a trip, you think you've eaten something, but it doesn't go away in 3 weeks or even 4 weeks, or it was actually 4 weeks or 5 weeks possibly. It doesn't go away. Do you think something else might have happened? You've got an energy in your energy field. Anyway, long story short, it turns out there was a little boy of about 5 years old caught up in her energy field. We released the little boy. No more toilet problems. And that kind of thing is quite common, as funky as it sounds. I could tell you stories until the end of time. But one of my teachers was a fellow called Roger Walger. And Roger used to lead, before my time with him, but he used to take groups that he was teaching out onto the Somme and other battlefields of Europe to release all of the souls that would have been trapped there. Because if you think about it, obviously lots of people died, but lots of people would have died in states of confusion and shock. And when we die in those states, then we get stuck. If you go into Far Eastern traditions, and if anybody's ever read the book of the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, or looked at concepts like that, they talk about how to die. They talk about how to die properly, how to close properly. Gandhi apparently did it, died properly. In Western Europe, in the Western world, we don't have that concept. We don't have a clue about dying. We think it's an awful thing. They see it as a part of the cycle of life. And, in reincarnation, when you look at it, I can't claim to be perfect in that respect, but I think of it very much as part of the process. It's part of the transformation of our ongoing journey. One final story before I stop for questions. I remember a girl came to me about however many years ago, and she said, I can't sleep at night. Can you help? She said, I've been to hypnotherapists, I've done conventional hypnotherapy, I still can't sleep at night. And anyway, we had a chat. I said, so what are you thinking about? And she said, oh, different things go through my head. And I knew she was sort of lying to me. And we continued talking. I said, what are you really, really afraid of? She said, well, actually, I'm afraid of dying. She said, that's what's kept me awake since I was a little girl, since I was 7 or 8 years old. She said, that's why I've come. And I said, look, we have a little bit of a problem, because if we go into a past life, then we're going to go through the death point. But if you can just trust me to guide you through that experience, okay, then you will come out at the other side. And she, the universe is quite ironic often when things like this come up. And she went into life as a warrior, so she was going to die pretty quickly in the past life. And anyway, she went into the life as a warrior. There was 1 battle, 2 battles. She died on the 3rd battle or whatever it was. We went through the death point. We did a bit of transformation from it, and she came out of the regression. She said, that was okay. And I'd explained to her before, I'd said, mentally you can understand this, but part of you still won't like it, but you've done it before, so it's easy. She said, that was okay. That was fine. But anyway, she sent me an email a few days later, and she said, I'm sleeping. She said, I'm sleeping at night. It's okay. And then 3 weeks later, her mum died. And I sort of knew her through a friend of a friend of a friend, and I found out that mum had died. And she, a month after that, whatever it was, she sent me an email. She said, you know what? Mum dying was simply not nice. It was awful. It was horrible. But I think if I hadn't have had that regression, it would have been devastating. Now I have a really good sense that Mum's actually okay, that she's fine. And there I will just pause for questions.
Thank you. Right. Who's some more questioning?
Yeah, and we know that time in Peru, when you were you have that feeling about that person. Oh, I just do not want to be married to her.
I had a knowing.
You had a knowing, yeah. Do you think that maybe that was something that in the past went very badly for you, that you thought, I don't want to go down that road again?
Well, I also think if I'd have, I think you could absolutely be right. On a practical level, I think if I'd have married that person, I would have stayed in my job sitting behind a desk for the next 30 years. And I wouldn't have been doing what I'm doing now. I felt as though it was a soul calling in a different direction. Well, at least that's how I justify it.
Can you actually describe that? What that meant? Knowing?
I've always been a knower. Some people when they go, some people get gut feelings. I get gut feelings. Some people are, you describe your vision. When I go into a past life, for example, I don't. I see a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I know the story without knowing how I know it. I get a sensation which comes through my whole body when I know stuff of profundity. I mean, I used to be somebody that people wanted on their team in pub quizzes because I'd know stuff without really knowing why I knew it. Ideas would come into my head. It would be something I'd seen on TV. I wouldn't have that information in my conscious mind, but I could recall it from somewhere. I knew stuff. And when it's that Machu Picchu experience and other experiences that I've had subsequently, it's a whole body knowing. It's a full-on body sensation of this is reality.
Right, so you get a vibe about somebody, positive or negative, and you think that might be connected to previous stuff.
Could well be. I think that was more about me than her, to be honest with you. I think it was my own personal journey.
It's more of a statement rather than a question, but it might turn into a question, who knows. Interestingly, when mediums are doing a demonstration, Gordon Smith or whoever it might be, they often bring back the spirit to communicate with the living, if you like. And the medium will often say, I feel a pain in my chest, this person has passed with a heart attack, or I feel a pain in my head, they had an injury to the head, or wherever it may be. It's normally as the spirit comes back, and I've read about this, that when the spirit comes back, because it's coming back to the earth plane, they have the last, the last experience of their earthly
You
life.
didn't have something nasty in the throat in a past life, did you?
I think I've got a chest condition in the past life, that's true. But yeah, they tend to have an experience when the spirit comes back, they experience how they passed out of this life, i.e. whatever it was that killed them. And it's interesting that when you've got people that have issues in this life, that it tends to be, more often than not, it seems to be, that it's the death issue that's coming back to them again in this life. It's like they're re-experiencing the death issues. And I just wonder, in the sense of that, when you go to the spirit world, it's all sort of nice and cosy and things like that, and you're meant to be healed of all your earthly issues and, you know, ironed over or whatever. That when you come back to this one, it's like you bring back the whole junk of it again, and you have to thinking, sure, you should come back as a clean slate. And it's like, you know, it's like you're trying to come back and improve your lot with another lifetime, but you've got this dangling bloody issue that's come back with it. And it's just a real annoyance, I'm sure it is. I mean, it's like as if God or whoever hasn't designed the system perfectly. I don't know what your thoughts are. It's not a question.
Why wasn't it sorted in the car wash for souls? That's what you're saying, yeah?
It should have all come out in the wash.
Yeah, you know, the soul chooses to learn. So I could argue, and I might not convince all of you, but I could argue that all physical stuff is a manifestation of an emotional reality. Yeah, and that's really what we're learning on this planet. We're learning emotional responses, because in spirit, let's call it unconditional love, bliss, joy, whatever you like, there isn't that bigger range of emotional responses. So it's only on Earth that we can actually get, and any other planets which are of an Earth-like density, where we can get that ability to work with our emotions, which will get triggered by physical stuff, which will be in part physical stuff, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And we choose to work with it. You know, I think that in the 20th, end part of the 20th century, stroke 21st century, I think that there are a lot of people in incarnation who are choosing to clear up their soul closet. i.e. we're all coming back to work with a lot of stuff that remains unhealed from previous lives, because the Earth is shifting. Vibrationally, the Earth is changing. As a species, we have nowhere to go. We're either going to destroy the planet or we're going to evolve. Maybe not in our lifetime, but perhaps in the next one or the one after. We have to do something. So I think there's a lot of us here who are choosing to clear all of that, so that we can evolve within ourselves to help the collective move on.
And it's not just this planet, is it? Because there's a lot of people who think they've actually come off planet to get involved as well, which is kind of a wider idea, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's not uncommon. Dolores Cannon's talked about people coming from other planets, other star systems. I've had them, you know, I've had them in regressions. I remember the first one I ever did was a businessman who came from Canary Wharf. Couldn't get him into a past life in Earth, ended up describing life on another planet to me. Fascinating.
That's good Canary Wharf,
Yeah, there you go. I remember doing a group experience to an off-planet past life, and I had about 12 or 14 people in the room, and 3 of them who didn't know each other had the same past life experience on a different planet. They were on a planet where they were blue. That was fascinating. I years ago I did a workshop in a Buddhist center, and I had a whole bunch of Buddhists there, and you know, I sort of did my talk and set things up, and we were going to do a group regression experience. And the Buddhist said, well, what if we go to an animal life as an elephant or a dog or whatever? And I said, well, you know, if you do, you do. Well, you just do your best with the experience. None of them did, interestingly. I personally think that animal souls are a different vibrational frequency to human souls. I think it's like a different, it's not better, it's not worse, it's just a different vibrational frequency.
I think that people can have like a coming back and a relationship with other people, but also with animals.
Oh well, animals come into past lives in that respect. Quick story. I remember years ago I had a Japanese lady who lived in London who had the most appalling rhinitis, and when she told me her story, she used to take her daughter for riding lessons. She used to drive her daughter to the stable, who was 14, so she couldn't drive herself, and the lady was divorced, so she had to take her to the stables on a Saturday morning, and this would trigger her rhinitis. So she'd have 6 days of appalling rhinitis. She'd get remission on the Friday, and then she'd have to drive her daughter to the stables again on the Saturday. This has been going on for however long it had been going on for. In the past life that she went into, again, she was a warrior. She was on a horse. She was riding into battle. And the horse threw her off behind enemy lines, and she was killed. So when I did the processing, part of the processing, with a past life is bringing in the characters that were in the life and saying, like Elizabeth and Mary, what is it that you wanted to say to her that you could never really say at the time, trying to get closure. So in this, pretty much the principal other character was the horse. So I said, okay, the horse is coming into the light, into the spirit realms, wherever you are. What do you need to say to the horse? Anyway, long story short, it was really, the horse turned around and said, well, I wasn't a war horse. And this was way before the film War Horse came out. I wasn't a war horse. You never asked me. You just took me into battle. She ended up apologizing to the horse as the past life character. Wild and wacky, but the rhinitis stopped that day. Truth is stranger than fiction sometimes. So yeah, animals come up. Cats. I've got, who is it? There's somebody. One of the things I do is I buy and sell crystals. It's a little bit of a passion of mine. There was somebody who was around my house the other day who was going, blah, 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 can't stand cats. And I looked at her and I said, have you ever been to Egypt? And she said, not in this life. Cats were guardians of the temples in Egypt, so cats often come up.
It's interesting to talk about animals and reincarnation, because I've read Jane Roberts' books,
Seth
Material. For those that don't know, Jane Roberts was a medium, although she wouldn't have called herself a medium, but that's what she was. And she was doing this thing called channeling, although she wouldn't have called it that either. And she was around in the 60s, 70s and 80s. She died in 1984, aged about 53 or 52, something like that. And she brought through this entity, for want of a better word, called Seth, and she would go into a trance, throw her glasses onto the table, and start speaking with a male type of voice. Now, he obviously gave her a lot of descriptions about himself, but he actually said, most of my consciousness is focused in another world, if you like. I interact with Jane Roberts here, and we produce the Seth phenomena. Her consciousness meets mine in the middle, and that is what you perceive as a Seth phenomenon. But also, I do have part of my consciousness projected into that of a dog on Earth currently alive in the 70s. And so there was a dog somewhere on planet Earth in the 1970s that was part dog and part Seth. It must be the last scene maybe, I don't know. But just thought it was an interesting thing to throw in, I don't know. Very clever, wise dog or something. But yeah. But later on, in one of the later Seth books, Jane Roberts' husband was asking Seth some questions. And he says, many years ago, you told us that you had a projection of your consciousness into a dog on Earth. Is that dog still around? He says, no, the dog died a few years ago. So, although he can still remain in the spirit world, an aspect of him has died on this world, which was quite an interesting thing. Like you say, split fragments of energy or whatever.
I bet it was a Blue Peter dog.
Yeah, probably. Shep
or
something, yeah. Now, what about when people, under hypnosis, I'm thinking now UFO abduction cases.
I had a lady, I did a course I was assisting on a few years ago, and there was a bunch of crazy people on the course, beautiful crazy people. A particular module of that course was current life regression. And a girl came running out of the room to find me because I was supervising 2 rooms at the same time. And she said, quick, come and help. And I went, and I said, what's the problem? And she said, she's been abducted. And I checked, and this lady was so deep in trance, it was unbelievable. And she'd been consistently abducted since the age of 7 and taken up into a ship. And as I say, that course was full of crazy, beautiful people. She was the most normal person on that course by some distance, yeah? She was an accountant or something, and no disrespect to accountants, but she was incredibly normal, yeah? And so, yeah, and they were experimenting on her. They were, I can't quite remember what they were doing, but yes. And she would be testament in my brain and my reality that these things happen, because that for me was proof.
Wow. Yeah, because many people that claim to have been abducted, they only remember pockets of information, but as soon as they go under hypnosis, they come through with so much more information. And it turns out it's not just one abduction, but like you say, it's repeated abductions through their childhood and adulthood and everything. So,
what I should say about that lady, and this rarely happens, was that she had no memory of that after the regression. We had to tell her.
You had to tell her. Was it still that buried deeply within her? She must have been shocked. Yeah. Wow.
Especially as she, some of the other girls on that course would have gone, yes, it was me. She really wasn't, it was a real shock to her system.
Wow. Any more questions?
Yeah. Shall I tell you about the birthmark?
Yes.
I'll tell you a couple of things before I tell you about me, so you can get a picture. I was always interested in knights. Funnily enough, when I was about 4 or 5, I got a knight outfit. I used to play in it, thought nothing of it. When I went to school, I went to a private school. In the first year, I got asked, would I like to go and do fencing? And of course, I thought, no, I don't want to go and do that. So for a whole term, I kept saying to my friend who was sitting next to me, he was West Indian. He latched onto something, and I never realised till much later. He kept saying to me, Rog, I think you'll be a very, very good swordsman. No, the size I am and everything else, I won't be able to move quick enough. No, you will be. Well, I did actually get into the school's fencing team, so much so, we actually played against, in those days, it used to be a merchant shipping called HMS Worcester. We used to actually go and train to be in the merchant navy, and we actually went there, and I was one of the members of it. Later on in life, I found out what birthmarks were all about. Well, I've actually got a birthmark under here, right in line with the heart, but when I traced it, it's the shape of a broadsword. And I never realised it.
Wow.
Nobody ever told me. I asked my mother, I said, what is that mark? I don't know. Nobody could tell me. It's only sort of after about, 40 years later, I found out what it was. So at the moment, I'm just wondering what that is, and where I was, and how many lives back that may have come through from.
Ever been attracted to a particular period in history?
Yes, I certainly think so.
Which one?
Well, around where you had jousting and whatever. I've never been on a horse, or hardly. And somebody kept saying to me, you should get on a horse and just see. Because funnily enough, my grandfather actually had a farm, but they got rid of 2 farms before I was around.
You should get on a horse and just see. I'll tell you a quick horse story. That first past life regression that I ever, another horse story. First past life regression that I ever had, where I had that smell and I knew exactly where I was. I was lying on a battlefield, dying with a horse across this knee. As it happened, about 5 years previously to that regression, I'd actually torn my medial meniscus in kicking a football in the back garden. And something had made me not have the operation, and so I had physio for 6 months. About 3 years after that, but still before the regression, I'd been riding on a horse in Scotland, and we were just walking back to the horse riding stables, and the horse sat down as we were moving with my right knee exactly under it. And the lady who was taking us horse riding said, I've been working with horses for 30 years. I've never seen a horse do that, ever. So, come back to the regression. There I am on a battlefield. Somebody has the wit, and we have to put the body right to make me get the horse off of my knee. Never had a problem with my knee since. So I'd get on that horse and see what happens.
Put a jousting thing on your arm as well. Just a whole picture,
No, I tell you, because, and the reason why I say that is because animals are much smarter than us for that kind of thing. The subconscious. The horse will smell you. It's like dogs who know that you're scared of dogs will bully a person. Yeah? Horses will be the same. It'll pick it up.
Can I just tell you something on that? Out of some, say, one's spiritual items that you've got of your guides, I didn't find out till quite recently, I've actually got 3 dogs as spirit guides. When I was small, I could never understand why dogs would keep coming after me. Could never understand that. And apparently there was one particular one or two I had, and then for some other reason, a third one has now appeared as well. But when I was small, the dogs would just sort of look at me, and all of a sudden, we're off.
Perfect.
Any more questions? We're all good? Right, we'll say thank you very much to Doug.